Now, verse 23, buy the truth, sell it not. And you deny today, don't have to buy. Come and buy without money and without price. Buy wine and buy milk and buy water and buy wisdom, by the way. And Christ is all of that for the child of God today. I tell you, this is quite wonderful. It was a brilliant young man. I wish he was here to tell you, but he did tell us, did he not? And that was Paul. He was Rabbi Saul, you remember. Smart boy. But he says, Christ has been made unto us wisdom. How wonderful. Then, verse 26, my son, give me thy heart, and let thine eyes delight in my ways. I know somebody's going to say, now, Dr. McGee, I've heard you say that God doesn't want your old dirty and filthy heart. I still say that. But it says here, my son, give me thy heart. He's not talking to the unsaved man. He's talking to his son. Talking to one who's been born again, got a new nature. Now he says to the boy, now I want you to come to me, and I want you to yield yourself to me. If you love me, he says, keep my commandments. Now if you're in love with him, now he says, give me your heart. If you're not, why, forget it. I think that would be his word. If you've been redeemed by the blood of Christ. And now if you have been, you can say, take my poor heart and let it be forever closed to all but thee. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Now, then in verse 27 and 28, for a harlot is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. Now, if there's anyone that thought that I was wrong about saying the stranger was a harlot, then here we have the two made synonymous, and that would answer that question. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men. And there are two men that are evidence of that. Judah, back in the book of Genesis. Man, that's a sorry chapter that tells his story when he went into a harlot. And then Samson, you remember. If he could be here today, he said, I tell you, I found out that a harlot can give a pretty good haircut. And that's what happened to him. Now, verse 29, who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath anxiety? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Now, again we have this warning against this matter of wine. And now we've had the word against wine, women, but there's no song, because at the last it biteth like a serpent. It stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thy heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the heart of the sea, or as one that lieth upon the top of a mast. May I say that this is a warning against wine women, and there'll be no song. What a tremendous proverb. Now we begin with verse 1, chapter 24, and let me read it. Be not thou envious of evil men, neither desire to be with them, for their heart studieth destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. Now, this has been before us before. Anything that is important, you find a repetition of it in the book of Proverbs. We've seen that relative to several things. There's been a warning about the abuse of the tongue, for instance. A great deal was said about the tongue, and a great deal about pride, and a great deal about a fool. These are things that are constantly emphasized, and they certainly are translated into life. You find these folk on the sidewalks, not only of New York, but of your town and my town. That's the reason I said you will find a proverb that'll fit every person that you know. And a great many of those in the Bible, as we've already seen. I think you'd find one for everyone. I haven't taken time to call attention to those. But here, I can call attention to the fact that back in the 73rd Psalm, you'll recall that is a psalm not of David, but of Asaph. And David had had the same problem. And again, he said he was envious. In verse 3 of Psalm 73, Asaph says, "For I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." And not only were they prosperous, he saw that they are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. And not only that, they blaspheme God. Verse 9, "They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walketh through the earth." Now, he was disturbed about that. I'm of the opinion you've been disturbed by that. I know I have. As I've looked about me, I remember as a boy, I was a poor boy, and I couldn't understand why I had to be a poor boy and work as I had to work, go to work when I was 14 years of age, and I wanted to go to school, and a lot of these other boys, in fact, the matter is, were dropping out of school, and yet they were able to go. And I had a real question mark. And here again you have that, "Be not thou envious of evil men, neither desire to be with them." Why? Because there is a day of reckoning come. And it was this man Asaph that could say in Psalm 73, verse 17, "Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then understood I their end," that God will deal with them. And according to your pattern and mine, there's a great deal of injustice in this world, and there's very little that you and I can do about it. Now, we've been in a generation that has protested everything, and they've attempted to level off a great many things that are in the world. I don't think they've done a bit of good myself. All of this protesting just doesn't solve the problem, because the problem is in the heart of man. The heart of man has to be changed. But God is the one that's going to level this thing off someday, and we can trust Him to do that. I think you and I need to recognize our place in life. It's going to make us a much happier person if you and I realize God's put me in this particular place, and I am to fulfill a purpose here. And I look at that man over yonder. He is prosperous. He's a wicked man. I don't understand it. And tell God you don't understand it. That's what Asaph did. I've told him that a dozen times. I didn't understand it. But the important thing is to go on with him and understand that God's going to work it out. And the Bible is just filled with instances of wicked men that came to a bad end. You begin at the very beginning. You can start out with Cain, and you can come right on down, and you can find this man that we call Lot. And he was a saved man, went down to the city of Sodom and prospered. But there came a day when he wished he hadn't moved there. It was a sad mistake for him to do that. You go through the Word of God, and you can see how judgment has come time and time again. This is a very important statement. Now we move on here in verse 3 and 4. These two verses are quite wonderful also. It says, "Through wisdom is a house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the inner chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches." Now, this is a very wonderful picture of what you and I are to do. We are to do the same thing that a man who builds a house, and then he fills that house with furniture and lovely pictures and tapestries and many lovely personal items and many valuable things. And it's just wonderful to see a home like that, a beautiful home that's wonderfully furnished. Now, may I say that you and I ought to be building us a house down here, a house of wisdom, house of knowledge. And then we ought to begin in our minds and in our hearts. Ought to be a lovely mansion. And then we ought to fill it with all kinds of wonderful furniture. and beautiful pictures and lovely things. That's what we ought to be doing down here. Study, Paul says to a young preacher, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now that's what you and I are to do down here, in filling our hearts and lives with the Word of God. Build a lovely home. Fill it with lovely things. You know, it's tragic to see some of the hovels. I was down in South America, and a missionary took me on a visit to some of the homes. And I want to tell you, some of those homes were just what you'd call a lean-to, made out of old boards, some of them decaying, a dilapidated place. And then you'd step inside, and honestly, there was no place to sit. They didn't even have a chair. Just stood and talked to them, and over in the corner there'd be an old blanket, looked like a blanket, or a sheepskin over that. That's where they slept. There was no bed, and they cooked on the outside. And I thought how tragic that was. Frankly, it made me sick going back. Miss Missionary was used to it, of course, and worked with those people for years. And she recognized the awful poverty, but nothing she could do about it. But she was doing a marvelous work there among those people. But I was sick just thinking of the poverty of those people down there in South America and what they lived in. But friends, up here in North America, I know a lot of Christians that should have spent their lives building a lovely home, that is, spiritually, and filling it with all kinds of wonderful treasure out of the Word of God, and that type of a life. And yet, may I say to you, you meet them, and you find out spiritually all they got's a little hovel. And when you look on the inside, oh, the ignorance. There's nothing there. Absolutely, it is bad. I was talking the other day to a group of preachers. They agreed with me on this. I don't know they would say it publicly, but I do. I think the biggest tragedy in our churches are the ignorant church members. Oh, do they have a vacant house, little old hovel, and nothing in it. That's the tragedy of the hour. Through wisdom is a house builded. Oh, that he might make us wise. Now he goes on to say, a wise man is strong. Yea, a man of knowledge increaseth strength. For by wise counsel thou shalt make war for thyself, and in the multitude of counselors there is safety. You'll have a great many resources and recourses, not only folk that you can appeal to today, but back to the Word of God. I don't believe in this method when you want a decision of just opening the Bible and looking at a verse. That's no good. The Word of God is not a roulette wheel that you turn and just hope it stops at the right place. Now, may I say to you that if you have read about what Moses wrote, and Joshua wrote, and Samuel wrote, and David wrote, and Micah wrote, and Zechariah wrote, and Matthew wrote, and Paul wrote, and John wrote, and you have all of that. They're counselors, and you can appeal to them at the time you need a decision, you see. We're going to move on down now. I'd love to spend time here, but verse 10, if thou faint in the day of adversity, thy strength is small. In other words, he's saying something here, by the way, that's rather important, and it's just simply this. It takes a man to do a man's job. Or, as you've heard the bromide, never send a boy to do a man's work. Never. If thou faint in the day of adversity, thy strength is small. You see, it takes these times of real stress and strain, these times of testing. That's the way God develops our spiritual character, and that's the way that He enables us to grow. It's in that hour of trial that you and I really manifest the spiritual strength that we have. It's a great comfort to know that many of God's men, even when the test came, they turned and ran. You remember when Elijah was so brave yonder on top of Mount Carmel, but word was brought to him that Jezebel was after him and she's going to kill him. And he took out, and I tell you, he ran for the wilderness. And when he got down there to Beersheba, he left his servant, and he continued on into the desert, climbed up and under a juniper tree and said, Lord, let me die. And, you know, David came to a place in his life when he was so hunted by Saul that he had not a moment's peace. He could say, Lord, I'm hunted like a partridge, and one of these days they're going to catch me, and one of these days I'll be put to death. And he became discouraged. But both of these men in that hour found out that the Lord would and did strengthen them. Oh, this is a very important proverb.